Getting back to the core criticism of the earlier version of Gaia, these words are from Richard Dawkins in The Extended Phenotype. It's a great book again. Dawkins is justly proud of this one, that Gaia can't have undergone natural selection, so it can't have evolved. End of story. Fairly convincing. There are... Lovelock sidestepped this to some extent by talking about joint regulation of the physical and chemical and biological system. The other hidden thing in Dawkins' statement is the assumption of a single level of selection. While in terms of complex systems, it's conceivable you could have a cascading of selection at different levels of organisation. So I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as Dawkins is saying, although in terms of the original form of the Gaia hypothesis, he is probably right. There is an anthropic counter-argument. A number of people have come up with this. Basically, self-regulation's incredibly unlikely to evolve, but nevertheless you can argue, may or may not be true, but you can argue that it's essential for the long-term survival of life. And so intelligent observers like us are going to find themselves on a planet where it happened. I don't like it. Lots of people don't like it. But logically, probably true. The second point is the most debatable, I think. And also, James Kirshner, I think it was, who did a strong weak classification, also pointed out that if we are in a planet that has, by chance, being one of the lucky few that made it, be on a planet where self-regulation happens, it'd be really nice to know how it works. Not an argument for just walking away. And of course, current understanding of physics would suggest the whole universe might need to have such a similar argument involved. If a few of the subatomic interaction constants were slightly different, then you wouldn't have stable elements heavier than helium. Tim Lenton, University of Edinburgh, I think, and then I think now at University of East Anglia, is probably the person in the world who's put most effort into trying to rationalise Gaia in terms of Darwinian principles. And one that I'm still working on, I really only started to appreciate it when I reread some of Lenton's work in the last few weeks, is that some aspects are sort of inevitable, that you will have negative feedbacks enhancing the stability, and that the things mathematically you need, the physical system is in principle stable. And in terms of the Earth's climate, there is a set point, if you like, simply because the amount of radiation the Earth gives off will grow as the fourth power of temperature, the absolute temperature, Stefan Boltzmann law. Biological systems tend to increase, and that the amount of life, its ability to grow, depends on the environment in a way that has a peak, that it goes up and then down again. Under those conditions, the system will, it appears mathematically, just be constrained to settle down with negative feedbacks, enhancing the stability of the physical system. In terms of simple equations, this appears to work fine. How it scales up to a complex system, whether the property persists, is topic of a far more detailed talk probably after sitting down with a bunch of guys in complex systems, a major research program. This is probably what I think Lenton would call innate Gaia, that it sort of doesn't have to evolve, it sort of just happens from the basic properties of the system. Talking about the observational evidence, and this is still under the objections group, I showed you the ice core data for the last I think a bit over 400,000 years. It goes back a little bit further now. It doesn't really look like climate regulation in its broad sense. The climate has swung back and forth, and it would appear not stabilised by life, except that the endpoints seem remarkably stable, remarkably consistent. that each interglacial, and until the present one with human influence, CO2 got up to about 280 parts per million and stopped there. In the glacial periods, it sat around between 180 and 200 parts per million. There seems to be some sort of self-regulation of the endpoints going on, but the overall cycle doesn't look Gaian. Lots of people have pointed out that the increase in oxygen, that starting I think 3,000 million years ago, that allows us to exist, was very harmful to most of the life that was around before that. And those classes of organisms have either been symbiotically absorbed into other cells or retreated to animal guts or very restricted swamp-type environments, low oxygen levels. Generally had a hard time of it compared to dominating the Earth for the odd billion years or so. A more extension of that view by a man called Robert Williams suggests that the Earth, suggesting there's basically a trend in evolution. A lot of people like Gould or even Dawkins would say there isn't really a trend, you're getting more complexity, there's just more opportunities, but that Williams is really identifying a chemical trend of evolution as being driven in its very, very largest scales by the increasingly oxidising atmosphere. And organisms have two responses, those that, like the earlier form, have to hide from the new oxidising atmosphere, but new class of organism arise to exploit it. And it's not just photosynthesis versus methanogens, suggesting that even multicellular animals, that the intercellular communication, I think it's relying on zinc being in a more oxidised state, that this is something that wouldn't work at lower oxygen concentrations, even apart from the energetic needs of being able to power a larger organism. Lovelock's influence on science, as I said, apart from the instrumentation, which is sort of universally acknowledged. Paul Crutzen, again, claiming there's no significant influence apart from the ideas about dimethyl sulfide. When you actually read his analysis, it's more about whether Lovelock is right, whether he's, especially the healing guy, whether he's been influential. My own view is that given the number of people who've been thinking about it, challenged by it, trying to work out what it means, that even if they never quite quote him, cite his papers, a lot of it's behind the thinking. I mean, it's, as I said, I would regard that Sagan satellite space probe experiment as an acknowledgement of Lovelock's ideas. I think for many of us, been a strong influence. Very sad that I missed him down at CSIRO last year. The other thing I picked up on during this, happened to flip open a book on biogeography from the late 70s, pointing out that provocative theory like this can awfully create a point where other branches of science can hang off and allow evidence to accumulate that otherwise wouldn't have quite seen the light of day. That suggesting that in the 60s, biogeographers looking at plant similarities really had to divide into two camps. Those that ignored the geological wisdom and said, no, this looks like continental drift. And for the moment, that's how we'll interpret it, versus those who had to arbitrarily create hypothetical land bridges, again with no geological explanation. And the two forms allowed us in a body of data to come out, to be documented, described, written. Now, as I said, in terms of Lovelock, even if he doesn't turn out to be right, I think he's influential. The book I've used, Dark Side of the Earth, Recounting the History of Continental Drift, raises the question, could you write a history of plate tectonics, which is now accepted form, without mentioning Wegener's continental drift? I think he very clearly writes no, in a sense, because he's written the book that very much builds on continental drift. I think it's right. And I think, in terms of Earth system science, trying to talk about the historical development without mentioning Lovelock would be a similar travesty. So I think his influence is definitely there and positive. Beyond science, I'm rather less concerned. I think often a lot of ideas extrapolating science into other fields of activity ranges from silly through to harmful. Lovelock's views, as a quote there again, I think these are, certainly from one of these two books, first one, a need for reference for the planet that sustains us. It's from Vanishing Face of Gaia, that seems all very fine. The concept of Homo sapiens as an infection or cancer on Gaia, I think is more in Revenge of Gaia, maybe in both, certainly implicit in both. Others have taken these ideas much further. Tendency to take Gaia as a religion. I'm not really convinced, very exceedingly sceptical about the idea of science as a religion. I think it's about as bad as Scientologists having science fiction as religion. Deducing social questions from the facts of science, I think, as I said, is rather silly. Einstein's theory of relativity, the word relativity, the kind of the theory of relativity is in the equations about the behaviour in space and time. The name relativity is a word that's hung onto it. It's a good word, but it's by no means essential to the equations. And so any implication that the equations imply anything about cultural or social relativity is just totally unjustified. More harmful, of course, have been, that I'd rate in the just silly end, more harmful have been the social conclusions drawn from Darwinian evolution through to justifying eugenics, imperialism and so on. And Stephen Jay Gould had a very fine article that actually traces some of the early stages, at least, of the religious objection to Darwinian evolution as being a moral revulsion of these unjustified extrapolations. Which reminds me, in terms of Lovelock's influence, I did Sidney Bloch's experiment that he mentioned during his talk on Freud. Let's use Google. So Gaia is roughly comparable to Freud at about 24 million hits, but when you do Gaia and Lovelock, you get only down to about 250,000. So we're not quite on the Freud scale because a lot of those Gaia hits are about other things, including a space mission counting stars that happen to be called Gaia. But still 250,000 hits is not bad. One of the strong two-way influences is his work with Lynn Margulis, who's very famous for over a long period promoting against strong initial opposition the idea that complex cells are really a product of symbiosis of simpler cells from the distant past, that chloroplasts in plants, the photosynthetic part of a plant cell, really came from free-living cyanobacteria. Likewise, the mitochondria in animal cells that exploit the oxygen, and right down to a number. Those are now becoming very well accepted, still challenging, or at least, given my knowledge that this is a little out of date, at least till recently challenging her ideas that some of the finer structures of complex cells are also the process of symbiosis. And this sort of gels in with Lovelock's concept, so it's a little hard to draw the boundary, but certainly, I think, a valuable two-way interaction. And certainly Lovelock credits her with pointing out to him that really the real action is at the microbial level, the different chemical lifestyles that occurred early on that could be exploited as the atmosphere changed. So what does this mean for global warming? And two totally different perspectives on this, I think. One is, if you believe in Gaia, the Earth system will absorb what humans do to it. The other one is be very, very frightened if we're the problem. Gaian self-regulation may remove us. Now, and it's this second view that Lovelock is very much promoting in the two most recent books. They could, of course, both be right, that a lot of the people who promoting a lot of anti-greenhouse information, the people like Ian Clymer now at Adelaide, saying, geological systems will self-repair. And he's undoubtedly right. If you don't care what happens over the next million years, you only worry about the million-year timescale, then the Earth will self-repair from what we do to it. It's survived worse. If you care about the next 100 years, then I think you need to take greenhouse effect rather more seriously. So this is Lovelock's book. So that's the subtitle. So one question is, or two questions. One, is it right? But even for the purpose of this lecture, is it Gaian? Is revenge a Gaian concept? I sort of greatly doubt it. Is it a fight back, or is Gaia retreating it, collapsing, taking us with us? Now, he said, think about it, revenge, the right word. Did I really think Pyrrhic victory? But in the end, I felt the right words for Lovelock's vision here isn't a classical one, it's a 20th century one, of mutually assured destruction. I think that is ultimately what Gaia is talking about in these books. I'm certainly not in a position to say whether he is right or wrong, but certainly no longer prepared to dismiss it. Said I wrote a book about greenhouse denial. 2 years ago, I actually wrote calling this alarmist. And I think now I regret those words. That hopefully it's not true, but it's hard to dismiss. Two things have happened. One is increasing scientific evidence and parallel arguments by James Hansen from NASA. And the other one is Lovelock's own explanation in the second book is rather better, I think, of what he's really on about than in Revenge of Gaia. So the Vanishing Face of Gaia, it's a better book, but in my view, better on the history, talks about the reasons why he felt the theory was slow to get acceptance, just felt it was a different way of thinking to the way that science is traditionally practiced. I think that's right, and I think that's why I think Crutzen was being too dismissive, that Lovelock was out ahead of the science. Whether he still is, depending on, you have to tie down what his view actually is right now, because he tries to have it both ways. Well, the issue I think really comes, to be put one way of capturing this is Lovelock's view, one that probably other people like Hansen mightn't put quite this way, that I showed the Vostok ice core data, the Earth flipping back between a cold state and a warm state. The question is there a third, warmer state that we're going to be pushing the Earth into through releases of greenhouse gases? Lovelock's view is there could be. It's based on rather simple modelling that in the book described them, but also published in refereed scientific literature rather earlier. The idea being that more CO2 gives warming, therefore the oceans get stratified, more stable. The hot water sits on top, the cold water at the bottom, they don't mix. In particular, what matters is what happens in the high latitudes where normally seasonal melting of ice gives you a density change, saltier water, and seasonal melting and freezing actually drives a deep circulation. If you decrease the circulation to bring in less nutrients to the surface, less algal production, less pumping of CO2 down into the deep oceans, which is an important process in the Earth's system. The fact that the ocean, there's concentration of carbon in all its forms in the deeper oceans is about 15% higher than at the surface, what's called the so-called biological pump. If you turn that off, a lot of carbon is going to end up back in the atmosphere and therefore cause a warming and just lock in this warm state. So that's my understanding of Lovelock's vision of this. As I said, other scientists coming at sort of heading in the same direction from slightly different grounds, but non-Gaian grounds, but that's the concern. So this, of course, is rather different from quite what the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change was saying in 2007, which is one of the sort of reasons I was calling Lovelock alarmist when I wrote two years ago. The concern that this is now out of date. There, as is the way of IPCC reports, published 2007, written over 2005, 2006, therefore had to rely from its own rules on work that was published and well established at that time, which means work that was written in, say, 2004, submitted to journals, observations made in 2003, and so on. So you're starting to get out of date by the time the thing hits the streets, which was now a year ago anyway. a number of new results. A scientific meeting in Copenhagen a few weeks ago confirmed that a lot of things are changing faster than the IPCC envisaged. Trying to relate this to Gaian terms, we'll try to think of it. If you have a tightly linked system, a lot of the extreme cases, if they're going to occur, will actually occur together rather than sort of being independent, which was the way a less integrated view of the science would see it. But also, having been inside the IPCC process, I was involved in writing one of the chapters back in 1993-94. The IPCC is often criticised as being politically manipulated, and I think that's very unfair. It doesn't happen, among other things, because it doesn't happen because the would-be manipulators are actually pulling in so many different directions, they nullify each other. And also they mainly get to influence the main detailed reviews of the policymaker's summary. If you go back and look at the science behind it, then it's essentially immune to that. But what I'm wondering relative to where Lovelock's at is, are we looking at a failure of imagination, of not thinking all the bad things could happen together? And when I started this talk, not the last person, but certainly someone I hadn't expected to be quoting was John Brumby. And in later times I'll have to explain this, but obviously none of us need an explanation about this one now. But that for a lot of people, as bad as you could imagine, didn't turn out to be bad enough. So Lovelock's conclusion, it's time to retreat. Certainly Vanishing Face of Gaia is very much a British perspective, looking at the UK as a lifeboat, that it may be relatively immune because the increase in warming will be partly counteracted by decreased ocean circulation, therefore a decrease in the warming from the Gulf Stream, and talk of the implications of sustainability of Britain in that sort of an environment. Certainly his strong analogies, we talk about a retreat, is feeling the choices, and particularly these are choices to be made at the end of this year at the Conference of Party to the Climate Change Convention in Copenhagen. Whether you have a retreat that's comparable to the British from Dunkirk or Napoleon from Moscow is a choice the world still has, but he definitely sees a retreat from unsustainability as necessary and seeing nuclear power as a key survival mechanism. Feels there's too little potential in renewables. This is partly built on a personal dislike of wind farms scattered across the British countryside that he loves. So, and I haven't tried to add up the numbers to check his numbers on this. So, are we there yet? In this case, we meaning mainstream Earth system sciences. Has Lovelock turned out to have a vision and the rest of us are now caught up with him? Or is he still way out ahead in a direction that the mainstream science may or may not ultimately catch up with, or it may turn out to be a wrong direction? And he gives both answers in his books. I'm not too upset about this. As I said, we'd all like ideas to be both well established and leave lots more to do. I sort of finished my own book, more technical book on some sort of similar vein 7 years ago. So, to try and explain that, the view that we're not there yet, we're certainly not at a version of strong Gaia. Lovelock, Reconciling Gaia, quotes William Hamilton, who did a lot about explaining how Darwinian evolution works, sadly deceased a couple of years ago, that looking for a Newton to explain how the whole thing works, that Lovelock is like Copernicus, he's identified a type of behaviour, but we don't know why it works. This actually is very much the sort of thing Alfred Wegener said, that the Newton of continent drift has not yet appeared, his absence could cause no anxiety. Now in that case there was an explanation later. The part that turned out to be untrue was the second sentence, that in practice Wegener was very anxious, and this may have contributed to him to wanting to get away from it all, do yet another expedition to Greenland, where he ultimately lost his life. But there was ultimately an explanation, but it was in a rather different form to what Wegener was really proposing. Or alternatively, you could say, yeah, weak Gaia, we're there. this is a paraphrase from Vanishing Face of Gaia, that the Earth system composed of a strongly interacting set of self-regulating components, physical, biological and chemical, and that our survival depends on this working, and for these reasons the system deserves a name. Lovelock's name for it is Gaia. That's all very fine. It's a rather weak ending, if that's really all it ends up with. As I said, at times Lovelock is equating Gaia just to Earth system science. He actually says, would you buy the vanishing face of Earth system science? Now, it's not even grammatical. It should be, we're not talking about the science, we're talking about the real world. Would you buy the vanishing face of Earth system interactions? Actually, maybe I would, but especially by Lovelock. But as I said, this is his weekend of saying, yeah, okay, these are the same thing. The world has caught up with me. How nice. So he's having it both ways. These are rather hard to evaluate. So, is he important? Yeah, I wouldn't have stuck my hand up to give this talk if I didn't think so. Is he right? Depends very much about what. I think he's right. Yeah, the system deserves a name. That's cool. The idea of a Newton for Gaia may turn it into something rather different, as happened with continental drift. In a sense, Newton turned Copernicus' ideas into something different. Copernicus was very much geometrical. Newton was terms of dynamics and forces concept he introduced. And he actually ditched part of Kepler's geometry, the part about solids fitting into the shapes of the orbits, defining the size of the orbits. That's just no longer part of anything. And then, of course, all these comments neglect the fact that Newton's concepts were totally restructured by Einstein's theory of general relativity, which explained everything in terms of non-Euclidean geometry. So the scope for changing a theory that describes a basic set of facts into a whole new conceptual basis can always be there, and this remains to be seen. So I think anything like strong Gaia is going to look rather different from what Lovelock envisaged. Tim Lenton's innate Gaia is something I'd like to keep playing around with. But that's it. So thank you very much. I think that's about covered it. I certainly have just about reasonably kept the time. So yeah.